I've told this occasionally in my ethics class, which is ironic when you hear the story, but essentially I lied in order to get my position in the prison when I first started 35 years ago. Suffice to say, I got this position in the prison essentially by late 20th century technology and a lot of two-stepping.
You're listening to Creativity Unconfined. Stay tuned to learn about how the arts unlock the doors for those who are imprisoned.
So you've been recording all these episodes and talking to all these guests, and we've gotten lots of feedback and thinking maybe we should throw it back to your humble beginnings. Think of Thoughts and Theories Thursdays.
But much more expansive.
Yeah, since we have all this podcast equipment now, why not? You get into some of the stories that you have that you'd like to share, and people would certainly like to hear. So,
Well, now there's a difference between stories I'd like to share and stories that people want to hear. I will tell the stories that people want to hear, I think, which is, I think, this is fun. It's this notion of digging deeper with Dave. Hopefully, these won't be special episodes after a while. Hopefully, we'll have enough of these. But, it's interesting that you describe it as humble beginnings. Because, quite frankly, I think I've told this occasionally in my ethics class, which is ironic when you hear the story. But essentially, I lied in order to get my position in the prison when I first started 35 years ago. I'll tell that story.
perfect.
Okay. So I was in graduate school at Vermont College in Norwich University in Montpelier, Vermont, and I was one of 16 to 17 students in my class. There were 16, 17 students in the year above us, and the way that the program worked is that we took summer courses there on campus, and then you had 9 months in between the two summers in which you would do your internship practicum experience. And so I had actually come from California to go to Vermont College. I had left New York years ago, went to Southern California, found that there was this wonderful opportunity to go to this graduate program at Vermont College, and I went back there to go to school. But before going there, I had actually worked with some rather aggressive youths in Southern California. I worked for a psychiatric facility that also, at the time, this is in the late 80s, where we would have a lot of people coming through that were involved with street gangs, particularly in Los Angeles. So I worked with a lot of aggressive youths, but I had also had my own experience with some stupid things that I had done when I was in New York. That's a story for another time. But suffice it to say that as we were finishing up our graduate program at Vermont College, this is already, I've done one summer of courses, did the 9 months practicum placement, had to go back to Vermont and to finish my graduate degree. I still had family in New York. I didn't know where I was going to go, but I knew that I wanted to end up in Northern California, and I knew that I wanted to work with a population that was reminiscent of some of the people that I knew growing up and some of the experiences that I had working in the psych facility, working with aggressive youths, particularly gang members. And I started kind of researching what types of facilities that could include. Now, understand, this is 1991. Research is a little different then than it is here. I couldn't Google anything. There was no computer database. There were these things that we had called yellow pages. And it just so happened, and there were these enormous, books with really thin paper that you had to find placements and just this locations of types of facilities that you may know would offer these types of services. I know I could be more vague, but let's just say that it started with me figuring out how do I find out what types of facilities California offers. And I wanted to go to Northern California. I wanted to work with difficult populations. I wanted to work with aggressive and violent populations as I had perceived it then. I've since learned that that's not always the case. It's not exactly the way to describe those settings. But I was young. I was impetuous. And I started leafing through these yellow pages. I started going through these occupational guides that were in the library at Vermont College. Now, it was a small school, but it had a fairly decent library. What's more is not only did it have a decent library, but I was on a work-study program with Vermont College to be able to afford school, and my placement was in the library. So after I spent an hour and a half shelving books, I had 3.5 hours to just kind of go through the stacks and start researching things, and then started pulling books out and started seeing all these listings for occupational positions, yellow pages for Northern California. There were different regions of Northern California. I had yellow pages stacked everywhere. And I said, I'm going to start cold calling these places. And you can't cold call the way it is now, where you just pick up a cell phone and you start dialing things and you get charged one monthly fee. We had in this building of 4 floors. I lived in the basement because I was the guy in this basement. We all lived in this dorm during the summers. That was kind of the rules that Gladys Agell, who's the director of our program, had established. I lived in the basement. On the first floor was a payphone, and we all used that payphone. Some people may have had phones in their rooms. I did not. I had a payphone. What I essentially did was I had a calling card. I had money on the calling card that would allow me to start making phone calls, start calling these placements up to find out if they had positions for an art therapist. Now, this is 1991. Most of the responses I get is, "What is that?" I'm like, so I started a tactic. So this is where it gets a little dicey. So when I started calling these placements up, and I'm looking at, I started calling jails, I started calling prisons, I started calling mental health facilities, I started calling state systems. And what I would do is I would call HR or a program director or a rehab director, whoever I could get a phone number for. And I say, "I understand you're looking for an art therapist." Now, most of the time I would get, "No, what is that? We're certainly not looking for an art therapist. We don't know what that is." I'm like, "Okay." I called Napa State Hospital. I called the Tuscadero State Hospital. I called Sacramento Department of Mental Health at the time. It's now, I think, called Department of State Hospitals. And in this book, I found the number for, I don't remember what book it was. This is 35 years ago. I still had a memory then. And I remembered that there was a phone number for the Department of Mental Health in Vacaville, which was a prison known as the Correctional Medical Facility that housed psychiatric care. And so I cold called a number, and it just so happened that it went directly to the rehabilitation director for the mental health unit in Vacaville Prison. And they picked up the phone, and I say, "Hello, my name is David Gussack. I am a student at Vermont College, and I understand that you have a position available for an art therapist." And she said, "It just so happened," she doesn't say just so happened. She goes, "Why, yes, we do. We absolutely do have a position for an art therapist. It's a rehabilitation therapy position for an art therapist." I said, "Oh, I mean, I have to." It's like, "Well, I'm sure, I know you do. That's wonderful," and how, and she says, "That's one. Are you interested in applying?" I said, "Well, I'm going to Vermont College, blah blah blah," and I'm explaining what I do and who I am and what I've learned and what my internship was about. She says, "Wonderful. How did you find out about us?" I'm like, "Well, it just so happens that not only did I have all these books of yellow pages and occupational positions and whatnot, I also had, because this is the 10th anniversary of Vermont College. It used to be Goddard College. This is now Vermont College. It was the 10th anniversary of the program, and I just so happened to also have the alumni directory. And I knew that one of the alum had actually worked in Northern California. And I said, "Well, so-and-so, who was a graduate from Vermont College about 8 years ago, had told me about the position and told me that I should consider contacting you and applying for the position." And she said, "Oh, that's wonderful. How is she?" Like, she knows her. She goes, she used to work here. She's now over at Napa State Hospital. I'm like, oh, yes, I'm aware of that. And I'm reading the alumni directory as I'm talking with her. She goes, no, I'm aware of that. She used to work there such and such a number of years, and now she's at Napa. She goes, how is she? I'm like, oh, well, she just got back from Europe. She had a wonderful time. She's doing great. And by the way, she says hello. That's great. Wonderful. Hey, could you send us your resume? And by the way, if you send us your resume and a cover letter, and if we like what we see, what we'll do is we'll fly you out here from Vermont to Northern California, and you'll have to go through a two-step interview process. One is to take an oral exam to actually get on the list to be eligible to be hired for this position, and then to actually interview for the position. And we'll do it right here in the prison. Like, that's wonderful. Well, let's set it all up. I'll send you the resume. She says, well, I'm going to assume that the resume is fine, so we can also just contact me next week and we'll set up travel time. You're graduating in August. We'll set up the time immediately after that. Wonderful. Immediately got off the phone with her, and I'm looking through the directory. I'm like, okay, so I had the phone number for this alumni student. I immediately called her up. I said, hey, so-and-so, you don't know me, but I'm a graduate. I'm going to be graduating from Gladys Segel's program at Vermont College. I am looking for a position in Northern California. I understand that there is a position available up in Vacaville. Could I use your name? Would it be okay if I contacted them and said that that you have provided me this information? She says, oh, that's what. We talked for like 10, 15 minutes about Gladys Segel, about Vermont College. She goes, absolutely. Tell them that I sent you, and we'll go ahead. And when you come out here, by the way, when you come out here, look me up. And we have some work to do for the art therapist for Northern California. So not only did I basically stretch the truth in order to convince the people at Vacaville that I had heard about this position instead of cold calling them, and that I actually knew the person who was going to put me in touch with them. But I then, and by the way, I've since spoken to this colleague. She became a close colleague, and we still remain close friends to this day. I did speak with her afterwards and said, by the way, I actually didn't quite know you before this, and I used your name before the position, and she thought it was hysterical. I also told the facility that I had actually lied to get this position as well. They thought that was appropriate. But essentially, what ended up happening is that she said, absolutely, use my name. The following week, or 2 weeks later, I flew out to Vacaville, took the positions. The director continued to ask me questions on how she was doing, and I continued to say she's doing wonderfully well. She's at Napa State Hospital. She says to say hi. I looked up the colleague once I got there, and I said, hey, I've landed here. I'm now here in Northern California. I plan on moving here. She says, that's wonderful. Hey, by the way, now that you're here, I'm going to be stepping down as the Legislative Affairs or Governmental Affairs Director for the Northern California Art Therapy Association. Would you be interested in being on the board of directors? Now, no, I wasn't. But I had used her name to get me this position, and I actually was able to finally get there because of this person. So, yeah, I agreed to go to that first meeting. And as a favor, I ended up taking that position while she stepped down. But that's a whole nother story. Suffice to say, I got this position in the prison essentially by late 20th century technology and a lot of two-stepping. So
Resourcefulness.
I guess that's the way for it. But it's funny because we talk about now what it's like for art therapists to get positions. Now, I teach ethics and professional issues. And since 1998, 99, since I've been teaching this class, I began this class when I was in Emporia State University in Kansas. The ethics class had always existed, but there was a particular assignment that I began in 1999 in which I had read an editorial by former president of the American Art Therapy Association, Bobby Stoll, who indicated that it's the ethical responsibility of all professors, all instructors at art therapy programs to prepare their students to find positions, to learn how to sell themselves, and learn how to basically explain what it is that they do and how they can make a position. And so since then, I've created a class in which, built into the ethics class, students are expected to do research in the positions they want, how to find that information, how to dig it out of whatever resources are available, and then they go through a mock interview process. And we've been doing that. I've been doing that for now 28 years. Needless to say, it was a lot different in 98, 99, 2000 when students had to find that information in a similar way that I had to, although it was a little bit easier. Now it's just they look online and they Google it. And it's so much easier because there are actually positions called art therapists. Then I was a rehabilitation therapist slash art. Now, granted, the slash was important, right? Everything to the right of the name is what I was. But we had to still kind of defend and explain and explore what it is that we do. And so here I was on the phone after 2 summers of figuring out what art therapy was, explaining why art therapy needed to be in the prison and why I knew that they had a position available. And it was out of 20 calls, it was the one place that said, yeah, no, we know what an art therapist is, and we just so happen to be looking. I mean, that was fortuitous. Now, I tell this story in ethics class, and they look at me like, we don't actually have to do that anymore. Now we know where to look. So there may not be there still may have some difficulties getting positions because it's not always easy, but it's a little different. So resourcefulness means something different at every era, I suspect.
Yeah, that sounds accurate. I think you'll be happy to hear though that I've been working with several organizations, and the feedback I always get is, oh, we love art therapists. Art therapists are always so prepared. They always know what's going on. I was like, I suspect that's because we have to really be able to justify what we're doing. We have to be able to explain it, and we have
Yes.
to work a little bit extra hard than people with LMHC or things like that. So I think it's still, an opportunity, a strength that we have, despite it being a little bit more difficult.
It is a strength. I think what happens is people have heard what art therapy is. They may not always know what it is, but they have certainly heard what it is. I find that there's a lot of people in our field, and I will include me. I would say there's a lot of us in the field that recognize the importance of going outside of our own boundaries, our own parameters. Because early on in the field, we were doing a lot of talking to ourselves. We were telling each other what it was that we were doing and why it was valuable. And when I was doing some of the early presentations about art therapy in prisons, it was still fairly new in our field. So I was telling ourselves what we were doing. It wasn't until later that we started. There's a lot of wonderful art therapists that were doing this way before I was doing this, but I think the important thing is for us to go outside the parameters of our own field to talk to those outside, like counselors and social workers, and I've spoken to criminologists and lawyers and anybody involved with carceral systems to talk about what art therapy is. That's tougher because it really is a matter. We know how to talk to each other because we use shorthand. We know what we mean when we talk about our approaches, and we cut through a lot of the early BS of trying to explain what art therapy is before we talk about why art therapy works in this particular environment. When we're finding ourselves speaking to those outside of our field, we have to really explain in detail what it is that works, how it's justified, what are the resources, what's the support, and how does it work in conjunction with what they're doing. And so I find that art therapy, we have to learn a language that can be shared amongst various groups. And that gets to be a challenge sometimes because we become so insulated, we learn our own vocabulary. And that in order for us to be able to communicate with others, we have to also learn theirs as well.
It sounds like this is also an ethical responsibility.
Oh, yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's an ethical responsibility to explore the transdisciplinary nature of art therapy, that it can fit in all these new places. And you did some of that, you and other pioneers in the prison work, right? I mean, having to build that foundation within those structures.
Yes, I will still balk at the word. I don't know if you saw my eye twitch when you used the word pioneers. I'm not a pioneer. There's only several pioneers in our field. And Gladys Agel, by the way, who is the professor who oversaw our program, she would say to us all the time when everyone would make the mistake of calling her a pioneer or calling Linda Gann a pioneer or somebody, they said, we're not pioneers, we're settlers. And so now, so they were settlers. If they were settlers, that makes me a homesteader or something. I don't know what that makes me, but I will say that, and there were people before me that did art therapy in prisons. They were just smart enough not to write about it or to present. I was I just felt compelled to write about it, and that's a whole nother story about how I ended up writing about it out of spite. We could talk about that at another time, but I think that one of the benefits of learning how to present this, and you're talking about the transdisciplinary relationships and the nature of it, to be able to walk that. In order for us to be successful, we had to learn how to negotiate the spaces that we found ourselves. How did our therapy fit within those realms? How can we speak the language of all the people that we're working with, and knowing that we have our own understanding of what our language is and trying to kind of tweak that so it fit within their structures. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that is an ethical responsibility on our part, because we end up, basically we end up getting a very much self-involved, and we kind of focus on our own language, and we become elite, and we feel that people have to learn what we do instead of us having to learn what they do, and that gets to be problematic, and I think we are successful if we know where we are and how to explore all that. I think that's the benefit and the value of what we're doing here with this project, the Arts and Art Therapy with the Imprisoned. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, of those who were artist facilitators and artists well before the art therapists came along. Too many people think that art therapy is completely separate from art, or art therapy is its own field separate from counseling or psychology and whatnot. And it was Julia King that said, we don't own the patent for crayons. We work alongside all of these groups and along all these people, and I learn from them and they learn from us. And as long as we can speak all of those languages, I think we have to be multilingual in order to be able to do what we do successfully, as well as non-verbally lingual. There's no such term, by the way. That's just, we're gonna make that sweep the nation.
Yeah, we'll cut to a screen with that word.
Was it multi-nonverbal linguistics? That doesn't that doesn't work.
We can wrap up if you want, but it leads me to another question that's sort of backpedaling.
Oh, we have a couple minutes. So
Okay.
Let's see what this goes.
So, you lie your way into prison.
Lied my way into prison. This is true. Yeah.
And you move halfway across. No, all the way.
No, all the way
again.
across. I
All the
was.
way
Yeah,
across.
yeah. There's no halfway. It was halfway back.
Yeah. And you find yourself there.
Yeah.
Was it what you expected, and did you have to learn a new language in that setting?
That is a question for another episode,
Okay.
because that's going to be a rather that could be a rather lengthy response, because there's a lot of things I learned, and there's a lot of things that I'm still learning, but it all started there when I was in a position called rehabilitation therapist / art at Vacaville Prison and Correctional Medical Facility in Northern California.
Well, that sounds like a teaser for the next
I
one.
think so.
You heard it here first.
Thank you very much. Let me know what you think, and I look forward to hearing your responses.
Creativity Unconfined has been brought to you by Florida State University's Institute for Arts and Art Therapy with the Imprisoned. Special thanks to our producers Sydney Nichols and Malia Burrows, as well as Florida State University's College of Fine Arts. If you like what you heard, and even if you didn't, please support us by liking and subscribing.